You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. Now, earlier this year, I had a chat with Gabriel Bergmoser. He's a Melbourne-based author and playwright, and we were speaking about his book, The Hitchhiker, which was the page iteration of an Audible original that he put together back in 2022, part of what he's sort of calling his avuncular serial killer series as part of the Maggieverse, and we'll get into that a little bit more today. But since then, the latest iteration in that serial killer series, The Lodger, has come out as an Audible original. He's also had a wonderful chat over with Craig Sisterson, which I'll link up on the podcast if you want to have a check out about some of his more recent writing. And with so much Gabriel Bergmoser on my mind, I thought it was a great time to bring you what our editor Cameron Furlong has dubbed the full Berg. And bring my full chat about The Hitchhiker that we had earlier this year, because it was just such an engaging discussion on the ways that we interpret and deal with the fiction that we read and create. So I'm going to throw you back over to past me and Gabriel Bergmoser to take you through this evening. Hope you enjoy. This is Death of the Reader.
Thank you so much for having me.
The first thing that people should know about this is this was originally an Audible piece of fiction that you put out, and you're now revisiting it as it's getting a print edition. What was the journey like between the initial kind of writing of this for audiobook through to where we are today?
It was tangled, as you know that transition would imply, but effectively what happened was that in 2020 I had a book out called The Hunted, which was quite a big hit for me, and that was an outback horror thriller type thing. So around the same time I'd spoken to Audible about doing a couple of original novellas for them, and they said that they would sign me up for 2 straight away off the bat if one of them could be this sort of outback horror type story. And because I'm a working writer and I need to eat, I immediately said yes, despite having no real idea for it, and then had to develop the idea from there. Now, because it was going to be outback again, generally speaking, I don't think any author likes repeating themselves, but because The Hunted had been this sort of high-octane, all-night siege story set in the outback, I had to make this something different. I thought, let's go small, let's go contained, let's go 2 people in a car, let's go Hitchcock rather than Tarantino, basically, was my approach. And as I wrote the book, I kind of finished it and thought, this isn't just a novella. I'm like, this is 100% my next novel. And Audible responded really well to it, and they got behind it. They did a huge promotion of it in 2022, which meant that it ended up being at #1 for a month in Australia, which was insane. It's like the only time in my life I think I'm ever going to be ahead of both J.K. Rowling and Stephen King in the top 10 chart. And it's purely because of the promotion they did. But, I'll take the technicality win 100%. But there was always that slight disappointment that it didn't have its place on the shelf with the other books. And I sort of sneakily said to HarperCollins, well, I've got this thing called The Hitchhiker, and luckily enough, they really liked it and they were happy to get behind it, and they saw how it has some crossover characters and some connections to the other books. So it's very gratifying to kind of finally, see it having its place on the shelf, because I really think it deserves it. And the response so far would bear that out, I think.
Especially because, like, The Caretaker, The Hitchhiker, and I think The Lodger is the upcoming one featuring sort of our first character we meet in this particular story. It's an idea that you've clearly kind of grown attached to in some ways. What was it that made that stick out to you as something you wanted to revisit through those other 2 stories?
The whole idea of a character who is Ted Lasso but a serial killer is just so enticing to write about and just so much fun. And, that character I enjoyed so much that I took him over into The Caretaker, and then Audible signed me up for a sequel very quickly after The Hitchhiker came out, which is The Lodger, which is coming out in October. And hopefully we'll also get a print release, so this sort of unofficial trilogy can have its place on the shelf. But it was just the fact that you don't often come across characters like that, like characters that feel so fully formed and they feel so complete, and they feel like you don't really ever have to think about what they're saying next because they're already saying it.
Yeah.
And I just straight away knew that there was more mileage in him. And I will say very clearly, his story is wrapped up in The Lodger. There won't be any more of him past that book, because I sort of got to a point where I was like, at what stage does it become diminishing returns? At what stage is it Friday the 13th, Jason Takes Manhattan?
Well, exactly, because one of the things that you said about, I think the particular word you used for him was avuncular serial killer, is the way that he is like this superhuman that is very mundane but frightening in being so.
Absolutely. And I think my biggest influence for that is the Hannibal Lecter franchise. And Brian Fuller, who was the showrunner of the TV show, which is one of my all-time favorite shows, he always used to say that he wanted to write the show in a way where there were always two interpretations you could have of his Hannibal at any one time. So, for example, Hannibal Lecter gets into a room he's not supposed to be in. Well, do you believe he's the devil, or do you believe he's a very intelligent human? If he's the devil, he turned into smoke and went under the door. If he's a human, he picked the lock. Yeah. But the show itself is never going to answer which of those is true.
Which is such a classic murder mystery
100%.
thing to do, right?
And so that's kind of my logic with this character, where this character in particular is potentially mildly supernatural, because there are a couple of points in both this and The Caretaker, and will be in The Lodger as well, where, you know, he knows things he shouldn't know, or he gets out of situations he shouldn't get out of, or he survives things he shouldn't survive. And my approach to that was, as long as I know in my head what the logical, realistic answer to how that was done is, I can get away with not explaining it, because I kind of like leaving the open door. I think it does create this sort of, is he like the devil a little bit?
Yeah. Like, the potential is just as powerful as the answer, if not more.
100%.
And I think one of the other things that's really interesting, connecting back to that idea of classic mystery, is that so much of the way that you structure the story, particularly in The Hitchhiker, is sort of micro mysteries. Like, we have throughout the entire book these short 50-page mysteries that are getting answered bit after bit after bit, that sort of drag you through such a short time frame with so many different questions. And it seems like such a juggling act to get all of that in there, right?
Well, I mean, I've got to kind of harken back to Thomas Harris and Hannibal Lecter here, because when I'm doing workshops with aspiring writers, one exercise I'll often get them to do is to write an opening line that will grab people's attention. And, you know, people always go for like, the bomb went off or whatever, or, you know, something huge. And I always bring up the fact that my favorite ever opening line of any book is the opening line of Red Dragon, which is Will Graham sat Jack Crawford down on the bench by the sea and gave him a glass of iced tea, which is one of the most mundane opening lines you can imagine. But the brilliant thing about that opening line is that because it gives you no context whatsoever for who these men are, no description, no nothing, it just announces them as if you should already know who they are. You can't help yourself. You read the next line. You automatically go, I've got to read the next line. And the next line is, you don't want to talk about it here, Crawford said. I don't want to talk about it anywhere, Graham said, but you've got to talk about it, so let's talk about it. Well, now you're going to read the next line. And the brilliance of that is that with every new line or paragraph, Harris is introducing another question. It might be a question as small as, who are these guys? But it gives you no chance to stop and decide whether you're bored or not. And by the time you get to the end of that first chapter, some of the questions have been answered, but so many others have been introduced that you're going to keep reading. And that, to me, is the structure of any good thriller, where you've got to start out creating what Stephen King always calls the gotta, you know, make audiences ask certain questions, and then introduce more questions as the new ones get answered, like little fish hooks that you keep kind of putting in until hopefully you've got enough in there that they're going to keep turning the pages till the end.
And I think one of the things that shows through that was like so clear as you're recounting that is not only the very rhythmic, melodic way that you recount those opening lines that have sort of made them memorable through their construction in more than just the questions that they ask, but also that despite offering so many questions, they're all actually statements.
Yeah, I'm really stoked that you said that, because that's kind of intentional, and you don't want to be posing in narration a ton of rhetorical questions, right? Look, I've done it, I still do it, but it can come off as a bit cheap if it's like, what was he going to do next? What could he do? All of this. So you've got to kind of find ways to create those mysteries through statements. And if you do master that, I'm not saying I have, but just like it's something that I strive for, then I think that works better, because it bespeaks a certain confidence that I think readers respond to, is my theory.
And I think that's something that you work with really well in terms of like actually breaking up this novel into the various flashback sequences. I think one of the really interesting things is that we have this character who goes by Paul in this book, who's a serial killer. A lot of the early part of the book is sort of coming to understand the mask that he is wearing. And I love the way that the flashbacks were sort of doled out in a way where when we first meet his wife, Robin, as a character, it still seems perfectly normal. And she almost discovers the answer at the last possible moment that like the audience has as well, even though she's been asking herself that question the entire time. And I love this idea of Robin as almost an off-screen character being a stand-in for the audience in that strange way, because usually that's a character that's like present through the whole book, but Robin has this very particular micromanaged role where that's the cold shock that you feel when you open the door into a galing wind.
And you know, it's that thing where if you're, for want of a better word, protagonist, or at least perspective character, is not going to be the audience's perspective, then you sort of do need a character there to stand in for that, to react the way that a normal person would, to say what the audience is thinking. And part of the trick with this character is that in the early parts of the book, his seeming naivety and his seeming jolly anything goes, I'm tackling the outback with, nothing but a pep in my step and a smile on my face, and you're clearly unprepared for it. It's supposed to make you almost yell at the page and go like, how stupid could you be? And then when he picks up the hitchhiker who's clearly threatening, it's also supposed to make you go like, when he seems to miss every single clue that would suggest the danger of this guy, the intention of it is that you as a reader want to yell at him and throttle him and shake him and everything. But then at a certain point, hopefully you start to realize there's more going on here. Like, he can't be that completely obtuse. And that's sort of Robin's gradual realization, is that his way of behaving isn't just a bit odd. It's a symptom of something far deeper and far more dangerous.
One of the most fascinating things is when that scene in the canyon happens where Steve, at that point in the book, threatens to push Paul into the canyon and Paul just doesn't really react. There's a small part of me that was like, have I been reading this wrong? And his happy-go-luckiness is actually what's going to get him through this. And then it was just this kind of stark realization where I was like, oh, I've been reading this wrong so far.
Right, well, because that was the point, the canyon moment in particular. With anything like this where there's a twist you're going to drop and you're wanting to plant clues, it's a delicate balancing act, right? Because you want to be giving the audience enough that when the twist comes, they don't go, wait, what? You want them to go, oh, of course, because all the clues have been planted. But the canyon moment where Jesse/Steve threatens him quite overtly and he doesn't react with anything resembling fear or anything resembling even basic concern for his own life, that was the point where it's very, very shortly thereafter that you find out the full scope of what's going on with him, because that was the point where I realized I can't get away with it any further.
Exactly right.
This is past the point where the audience will happily believe that this guy is simply naive. Now they're going to be like, there is something very off about this person. And so shortly thereafter, you have to reveal what it is. But hopefully, if I've done my job right, if you're coming in cold at that point, your assumption won't be as extreme as what the reality turns out to be.
And I also think one of the other things that's really fascinating about that is, for your regular readers who've read the rest of the Maggie-verse, as you've called it on your website, is that there's almost this enormously high barrier for entry for how much sin you must have committed to even be a character in a Gabriel Bergmoser novel. If you read Paul on the opening pages, having read the rest of your fiction, it's like, you've done some horrible things.
Yeah. It's funny. It's like I look at it now and I kind of go, if you collectively take into account all the protagonists in all of these stories, I mean, they're really just divided between the people who are irredeemable or the people who are irredeemable but are trying anyway, so you've got your Maggies and your Jack Carlins, your characters who have done some pretty bad things but are trying to make good with it. And then you've got basically everyone else, so yeah, there aren't very many innocents in this world, which is kind of fun. I don't know.
I guess for you as a writer, where does the nuance come in? Because you were talking about not wanting to repeat yourself. Where does the nuance in that characters laden with sin come in and keeping it engaging for you as a writer?
Well, to me, I think it's something that I've come to believe more and more the older I've gotten, and I guess the more I've lived, for want of saying anything else, is a couple of things. Realizing that everyone is the hero in their own story. So, unfortunately, we've all known people who have done some bad things and acted in bad ways and have treated people appallingly, but either perpetually self-justify or just don't believe or understand they've done anything wrong. And we all know those people. And then there's people who beat themselves up relentlessly for having behaved in ways that actually aren't that bad. But, at a certain point, I really do kind of believe in that whole, I'm not a religious person, but that whole, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. The way that people rush to judgment so quickly when, chances are they've got their own skeletons in their closet and everything, I find really fascinating. And so to me, it was really important that if I'm going to write in this dark, murky world where, there are bad guys and vigilantes and murderers and evil bikies and human hunting cannibals and whatever, to inhabit this world and to be dealing with these things, it would have been extremely inauthentic if my protagonists weren't a bit compromised themselves, in one way or another. They had to have done some sketchy things to be there. But to me, Maggie is a borderline psychopath. Jack Carlin is a bent cop who has done some really dodgy stuff in his life. But I also believe that these are two people who have learned from their mistakes or are trying to learn from their mistakes and are trying to work out how they can take the sins of their past and navigate that into something more constructive or something good or to save the next person. I think you see that very strongly in The Hitchhiker when Maggie comes into the story towards the end where, there's almost a realization on her part that she is going to be damned, but that Jessie doesn't have to be. Yeah. And that's kind of a big part of her journey going forward. So I know that there are people for whom the actions that Maggie's taken or her violence or her capacity for violence is off-putting. There are people who they can't read The Inheritance, they can't read whatever because they're like, I can't empathize with this person. Yeah. And I understand that, but to me, what's far more interesting is somebody who's made those bad choices but is really trying to make good ones now and is really trying to pivot and do something different. Because, I mean, if there's no such thing as redemption, then we all might as well be damned, right?
And I think one of the things that's most interesting about that is Jesse's role in this story, because he's almost like a response to Jack and Maggie in the way that he is at the opening steps of this perpetuation of violence, the opening sins that cast him into oblivion. And where does he go from those first steps, and the way that Maggie gets to interact with that and reflect on her own actions based on Jessie being her former self almost is such a fascinating idea.
Well, I mean, to me, one of the most fascinating beats in the book is towards the end, where I could almost reductively cast it as like a battle for Jessie's soul, where it's kind of Maggie and the driver both trying to reach him, and he ends up kind of leaning towards the Maggie side of it. But then there's also a point shortly thereafter where Maggie kind of tries to, because there's a point in the book where the driver kind of tries to, lure Maggie over to his side. Yeah. And she's probably more tempted than she suspected she would be. But then shortly thereafter, she basically tries to do the same thing to Jessie. She kind of tries to tell him, don't go and find the love of your life. Don't go and try to live this normal life. It's not possible. Do what I'm doing, stay on the road. And he rejects that. Like, he rejects both of them. And that sort of leaves Maggie in this place of thinking, well, if even this guy whose life I've just saved can't accept me or thinks that my way of life is just like tragic and sad and dangerous, then maybe I should have gone with the driver in the end.
That scene too is like so theater, especially with the placement of the flashback to Maggie talking with her foster father. It's like you could see the spotlight come down on the actor on the other side of the stage going into that soliloquy. It was beautiful.
No, thank you. I mean, it's in a lot of ways, The Hitchhiker is my most theater-inspired book, I think. I mean, my background is writing independent theater, and, for a lot of the first half, it is just two characters in a car. With the exception of a couple of action beats, the whole book is really a succession of duologues. It's like the driver and Jessie at the start, and then it's Jessie and Maggie, or the driver and Maggie, and then it's Maggie and Jessie at the end. But really, the entire book is almost all made up of conversations between two characters. And there was a quote in an Empire magazine I read when I was a kid that always stuck with me, which was saying that two characters sitting in a blank room exchanging well-written dialogue should always be more gripping and have more emotional pull than the most expensive CGI-laden battle you can imagine. And that was a ethos that I really had to take to heart when I was writing theatre, because we didn't have the budget to do anything other than two characters sitting in a room talking. So I like to think it's a skill that I kind of honed, and because I knew this book was going to be more contained and more restricted setting-wise and something like The Hunted or The Inheritance, it was a real chance to kind of almost write a play again. Like, it's not a play, it's still quite a visual book, but it was a chance to kind of flex those muscles and pull those old skills out again.
Do you feel like that came naturally out of writing for audio?
Funnily enough, no. Before this one, I did The Consequence for Audible, which was about Jack Carlin. And that was my first Audible original. It was much shorter. It was only 30,000 words. And that was one where I really tried very hard to write that like I would write a play, but obviously it was only one voice. So I sort of tried to stylistically make it feel like a character recounting a story over a campfire to you, where it's like he's very clearly talking to the audience, and treat it like a monologue and kind of write it for audio. And for a few reasons, I'm not convinced The Consequence quite worked. Like, it didn't quite strike the chord of something like The Hitchhiker or The Hunted. So when it came to doing The Hitchhiker, I sort of decided, I'm going to retreat a little bit and just write it as I would a novel. So even though I was employing the theatre skill set, I mean, I suppose there was talk early on from Audible about the potential of it being kind of an audio drama or a radio play, but that conversation never went very far. But I wonder if the DNA of that sort of subconsciously did seep into the writing of the book, because I don't think I ever sat there thinking I'm trying to write this explicitly for the audio medium. But I do think a certain performativeness or a certain stage style of writing did creep in at some point.
Talking, about Maggie coming into the story, she's a character who's had novels of her own. Is it different writing her in a story like this, where she comes in to sort of feature and reflect on the story as it exists, as opposed to being the focus of it herself?
It's so funny, because the answer to that question changed in the writing process. When I wrote the first draft of this, there were two key things that were missing. One was Maggie and the driver's final conversation. So Maggie turned up, helped Jesse, and then the climax happened. And that was it. There was no moment of Maggie and the driver having this kind of, heart-to-heart sort of the Batman and Joker interrogation scene kind
almost
of thing.
Almost more soul to soul in a weird way, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Because I don't think hearts are really factoring into those two characters all that much. Maggie more so than the driver, but yeah. So that scene wasn't there. And then the other thing that wasn't there was the flashbacks to Maggie's past, because I was just finished with writing The Inheritance. I went straight into The Hitchhiker, and I love the idea of Maggie kind of being this surprise guest appearance towards the end. And as I wrote her in that first draft where she steps in and she saves the day, or at least helps Jesse save the day, I kind of remember thinking it's almost like a holiday for Maggie. It's like, because in this book, and I know it sounds so funny now, but like a holiday for her is still, getting into death-defying situations and cracking skulls. But I thought in this case, she's not carrying the world on her shoulders. She's not, struggling with the weight of her own dark past or anything. This time around, it's purely just her stepping in and trying to help. But then when it went to editorial, Bill Massey, who was the editor, rightfully pointed out that if you haven't read the other books, which a lot of Audible readers wouldn't have, then this character kind of seems like a Marvel superhero. She turns up out of nowhere and she's just this superhuman and saves the day. The other thing he said was that we have to understand some of her past. We have to understand where this girl has come from. And that became a really tricky needle to thread, because obviously with Jesse and Paul having had their flashbacks threaded through, that established a precedent of exploring these characters' past through a flashback narrative that runs parallel to the main narrative. But I was very cognizant of the fact that we've already seen Maggie's past in 2 books, We know where she's come from if you've read the books, and for those who had read the books, I didn't want to repeat it. So the story that I ended up coming up with about her and the teacher when she was a teenager, that was kind of a way for me to shed light on her backstory while not repeating anything, while for readers who know the character, giving you a new glimpse into sort of an untold chapter of her past, because we've seen Maggie in uni, we've seen Maggie as a little kid, we've seen Maggie as an adult, but we've never seen her as a teenager. And so for that, I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. We can see what was she like at 15. And that was kind of fun for me to explore. But the cool thing is, right from the start of doing The Hunted, I've deliberately left huge swathes of her backstory really vague, so that when I need to come up with a little, anecdotal flashback thing that I can put in there, I can find something to fill it. But I've got sort of a fairly detailed timeline in my head of like everything that happened to her at every beat. But it's fun to kind of have those empty years where I can be like, well, in this year, what if she was living in a foster home here and doing this? And then that can, conveniently, that thematically serves this story.
Well, I mean, one of my favorite things about characters like that too is that as you start to come up with more of those narratives to fit in with the various stories that they become a part of, inevitably small contradictions will emerge from that sort of timeline. But going back to that discussion of like the inexplicable things that happen in stories, I love that there's like, well, was this the story that we were told because the narrator was unreliable in this particular story? And there's games you can start to play within your own, I guess, like meta fiction.
Well, it's funny because I'm working on High Rise at the moment, which is my next adult book out next year. And High Rise focuses on Jack Carlin, but it's a split narration between Jack Carlin and his daughter Morgan, who's a character who's been alluded to throughout the stories, but we haven't really seen in the novels yet. And there's a lot of backstory between Jack and Morgan that's been detailed in other works.
Yeah.
But
because one of his other kids was like a feature character in one of the other books.
Oh, that was Harrison Cooper's kid, the other cop. But so this whole thing kind of starts to play out with Jack and Morgan where, it's come up where basically new editors have been pushing back on certain aspects of the backstory and been like, oh, can we rework that? Can we rework that? And I'm like, well, that contradicts that and blah, blah, blah. But, it gets to a point where it's like, how far do you want to go down the rabbit hole?
Yeah, how big does the spreadsheet get? Do I have to make a database of my own?
Do you want to be focusing on the minutiae of everything? And the answer is, well, yeah, because you want it all to fit. Because I always can't stand it when I read a series or a shared universe thing and authors have arbitrarily changed details to make it suit for a new story. But the cool thing with this is that because particularly with Jack's stuff, it tends to be first person, you have to kind of always wonder how much of the truth were Jack and Morgan ever telling, because these are two characters who are very natural liars and two characters who play with the truth for their own ends. So I've kind of leaned into that a bit in High Rise, where because we're cutting between their first person perspectives between chapters, there's almost a Rashomon thing that's bleeding into it, where the way that they recount certain events from the past is very different to each other, and that kind of becomes deliberate, and that's really fun to play with. And that way you can kind of account for some of the, the natural contradictions connections that start to bleed in when you've written enough books in the same interrelated universe.
Going back to the idea of like dialogue being the thing that should be the most tense we were talking about, it's also that idea of, believe people when they tell you who they are, and how narration versus dialogue starts to interact with those various stories when you're like the perspective character versus the one in conversation.
I'm in the very early stages of working on my next book for Audible, which is something totally different, but it's called Backstory, and I think this is the first time I've spoken about it publicly, actually, but the entire I've signed the contract now, so I can talk about it, but the entire premise of it is that it's an epistolary novel where it's like 10 years ago, and people are going to roll their eyes, writers writing about writers, but I think it works.
You're speaking to the right person to unveil this one.
10 years ago, 5 aspiring writers finished their university course. They go for a weekend away to celebrate. They're all kind of the hot shots in their course. Everyone thinks they're the ones who are going to make it. One of them turns up dead. 10 years later, they're all successful in different fields. One's a romance author, one's kind of a literary author, but who's resentful about the fact that his books aren't selling what they're supposed to be selling. One's a YA author who thinks he should be writing better things, and so on and so on. They've all kind of gone their separate ways and all become successful in their own fields. But then a journalist finds out that basically the story they all told about their friend's quote-unquote accident that night wasn't quite what was told. And so she does some research and she finds out that at a certain point back when the court case and everything was still playing out, they've all tried to write a memoir about that night, kind of to cover their base and throw everyone else under the bus. And the lawyers got involved, shut down the memoirs, they've all been buried. But she managed to track down the draft manuscripts. And so then the question becomes who's telling the truth. And so the fun of that is you can kind of like semi-parody the tropes of certain writing styles, but also I truly love contradictory perspectives, and I truly love the Rashomon thing, and I love the fact that, my recounting of one set of circumstances can be one thing and yours can be something else, but no one's lying necessarily. It's just that, there's perception's one part of it, then memory's another part of it, what we choose to remember, what we hone in on, what we focus on, and that's so endlessly fascinating to me. And getting to write something like this is kind of the first time I've got to really delve into it, in that it is kind of the entire premise of the book. Whereas in other things like High Rise, I get to do a little bit of it, and that's kind of fun in and of itself. And The Lodger has a bit of that too, and I think it's been creeping more and more in. But just in general, that whole thing of, who's truth and who's reliable and who's not reliable, it's just fun from a narrative perspective,
And I think one of the other interesting things too about the way that you talk about that and the way that you write is that it seems like your stories have a very different relationship to spoilers to a lot of your peers. The way that you structure out stories and the way that it comes around those concepts of like, Maggie reflecting on the way that she is almost in response to Paul in this book, and the way that Jessie reflects her journey, and all of these characters bouncing off each other, that means that there's just this different level of things to discover in the way that you write in these kind of micro mysteries we were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one with spoilers, because I suppose if you're an author of whodunits, which I'm not, but I suppose I will be with this new one.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, well, I think in general, like, obviously you don't want to give the game away, and you do want readers to experience certain things cold. On the other hand, again, I take my cues a bit from Brian Fuller here, because I remember when the second season of Hannibal was coming out, and this was back before the AV Club became crap, but he would do a weekly interview with the AV Club after every single episode, and it would be this deep dive into minutiae of every single episode. And because I was a fan of the show and I was a fan of the entire Lecter property, I would read all these interviews every week. The moment the episode was finished, I was sitting there refreshing the website, waiting for the interview to come up. And I was always taken aback by how arbitrary he was with spoilers. Like, he would just openly spoil what was going to happen 3 episodes down the line. It was never so overt as to say character X is going to kill character Y or whatever it might be. But it was enough that if you were a close watcher of the show, you could read between the lines, easily pick it up. But the thing that struck me was that it didn't spoil my experience at all. So to me, when it comes to discussing spoilers, because there are so many things that can characterize spoilers, but I'm a bit in general annoyed by spoiler phobia. Like, yeah, there are certain things I want to talk around, I want to protect. But generally speaking, even the thing about the driver being a killer, yeah, that's a twist, but if you've read The Caretaker, no, it's not. And if you've read the first quarter of this book, it's not. So, like, does it count as a spoiler if it happens in the first quarter of the book? Like, I don't think you can be that precious about it. I know that people differ on this, and yes, like, generally speaking, in a perfect world, we do want to preserve our spoilers, and we do want to preserve the aces we have up our sleeves. But to me, maybe I'm being arrogant or naive or something here, but I like to think that the enjoyment of my books doesn't hinge on not knowing one big thing. I like to think that there's enough in there to enjoy that if you know one thing, it's not going to spoil the rest of it, you know?
We've spoken on the show about all sorts of things, like, the whole Penn and Teller, like showing the trick can be as cool as the trick idea and all that. But one of the ones that was really interesting with your book in particular is we often talk about on the show this idea of book one and book two, that crime fiction in particular, because of its dependence on twists and mysteries, has the book that you read before you know the truth and the book that you read after you know the truth. And one of the things that's so fascinating about your book is that I feel like it's the first crime fiction book I've read that I almost can't view with that lens, because of the structure and the way that it's paced out in these little micro mysteries. There's questions that you learn, but they only reframe so far back in the book, but in a way that actually I think works really well because it's constantly offering things to the audience in return.
I really, really like hearing you say that. Like, for example, I don't think the film stuck the landing, but I loved going to see Barbarian recently and going in thinking it was going to be one thing, and then 20 minutes into the film, it pivots in a totally different direction. I was like, oh, we're off the reservation. Like, I don't know what's going on now. And that was kind of what I wanted to do with The Hitchhiker. So it's not as simplistic as, I don't want to say simplistic because I don't think that trick is a simplistic one to pull off, but it's not, there's a book before you know and a book after you know. There's several books going on, and there's several layers to this, and there's several things to know, and several...
It's like a little candy jar of little questions that you just get to pick out.
So that's kind of what I was going for. So if I hear that lands, that's a really lovely thing to note.
Well, I certainly think it did, and Gabriel, thank you so much for joining us on Death of the Reader. It has been a delight talking with you and getting to dive into The Hitchhiker on the page.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
My name is Flex. Thank you for joining us here for Death of the Reader, and I'll catch you next time.